Let's get into Washington's Marines now. The two navies heading into the war, obviously very different. The United States, the colonies didn't even really have a navy. The Royal Navy is one of the most powerful forces in the world. This committee creates the Marine Corps, 2 battalions of Marines to be raised. So what basically is step number one after Congress declares 2 battalions of Marines to be raised? What's sort of the first process in building this Marine Corps?
Well, in order to build a Marine Corps, you have to recruit it. And so they started out with commissioning the first Marine officer in November of 1775. And he was actually identified prior to the creation of the Marine Corps. He was first identified on the 5th of November, and his commission was signed by John Hancock on the 29th of November. And that gentleman's name was Samuel Nicholas. And Nicholas actually was a tavern owner in Philadelphia, and he owned a tavern called the Conestoga Wagon. And he was very prominent in Philadelphia society. So he received the commission with two other officers as the first three Marine Corps officers. And their first task was to go out and recruit Marines, enlist them into the Marines. And they did that throughout Philadelphia. And many people mistakenly, and this is one of the myths of the Marine Corps that gets debunked, is many people refer to Samuel Nicholas as the first commandant of the Marine Corps for the reasons that I stated. In fact, if you go into the Marine Corps hallway in the Pentagon, it even has a painting of Samuel Nicholas and identifies him as first commandant. But that's absolutely incorrect. And the reason for that is because the Congress did not formally bestow the term commandant on the senior Marine until 1790 with William Barrow, well after the end of the American Revolution. Regardless, Samuel Nicholas was the first and senior most Marine officer, and he and John Shoemaker and John Welsh went out through the wharfs and the bars and taverns of Philadelphia and went and enlisted their first Marines. Now, the difference here is when John Hancock gave Washington the bye on not conducting this amphibious assault and naval campaign to capture Halifax, because we didn't have the ships to do it, we didn't have the 2 battalions to do it, they never did recruit 2 full battalions of Marines. What they did was they changed the model in order to have each ship of the Continental Navy have a company of Marines assigned to them, and they would also be known as the ship's detachments. And they would serve several roles on board ship. They would be responsible for the good order and discipline of the ship. They would protect the captain. They would fight from the fighting tops and snipe down at enemy forces on the opposing ship. They would provide boarding parties to capture enemy ships. And then they could conduct limited operations ashore in support of naval campaigns. And the way they would do that is either an individual company of Marines from one ship would go and conduct a small operation, or if they needed to do something larger, they could combine several companies from several ships and create a battalion of Marines in order to conduct a land campaign of limited duration. And that's, in fact, what the first Marines did with the first American fleet in March of 1776. So, as the first fleet of 5 converted merchant ships formed in Philadelphia in January of 1776, the Continental Congress gave orders to a gentleman named Isaac Hopkins, who became the first admiral of the Navy, and he was actually referred to as the commander in chief of the Navy, just like Washington was commander in chief of the Army. He was the first and final commander in chief of the Navy because in 1778 he would be cashiered from the service, and they never used that term again. But what the Continental Congress assigned Hopkins with doing was basically protecting the eastern seaboard, which the British and Royal Navy now had under blockade. And so his orders basically said you are to immediately go down to Virginia and find, seek out, and destroy the British fleet that is operating in the Virginias. And if that was not enough, once that was complete, they were then to go to the Carolinas, find, seek out, and destroy the fleet operating off of the Carolinas. And then once that was done, he was supposed to shoot up to New England and take on the British fleet, blockading the New England colonies as well. And think about this. This is the most powerful navy in the world that are manning frigates and men of war, ships of the line built as warships from the keel up. And the largest American ship at the time was called the Alfred, and it only manned 24 9-pound cannons. The British had ships that had up to 100 cannons on them, all the way up to 32 pounders. So Hopkins is looking at this and he goes, "You got to be flipping kidding me. We just formed the Navy in Philadelphia a few months earlier, and this is their inaugural cruise. They've never rehearsed together, they never operated together." And so he continues reading his orders, and there's a caveat in there. And it says, "Oh, by the way, if the weather doesn't permit or some other unforeseen complication occurs, use your best judgment in what you do with the fleet." Well, Hopkins had earlier received an intelligence report that George Washington was critically short of gunpowder, holding the British under siege, which was true, because in fact, he only had enough gunpowder to provide each army soldier with 9 rounds to shoot. That was it. If the British knew that, they could have assaulted and they would have wiped out the Continental Army at that point. But Hopkins heard that the British had stockpiles of gunpowder being stored down in the Bahamas, specifically at an island called New Providence. And there were 2 bases down in New Providence, Fort Nassau and Fort Matangau, that were holding this gunpowder. So Hopkins thought about it and he goes, "You know what? I am not going to go be defeated against these 3 British fleets. I'm going to go get the gunpowder that Washington needs, and I'll come back up being a hero, bringing all these critically needed supplies." So he sets sail, goes 1,000 miles south to the Bahamas, and en route, he has 2 officers on his flagship, the Alfred. And one of them is a first lieutenant named John Paul Jones, who would become very well known in Navy lore. And the company commander for the Marine detachment on the Alfred was Samuel Nicholas, the most senior Marine. So en route down south, Hopkins pulls Samuel Nicholas in and says, "I want you to create a battalion of Marines by combining all of the Marine detachments on board the 5 ships of the Navy, and you're going to conduct an amphibious assault and capture this gunpowder." Well, Hopkins winds up pushing his fleet too close to the shore, and he gets spotted and alerts the British on New Providence before the Marines can land. So he adds 50 sailors to the landing force, and there were 234 Marines and 50 sailors. They conduct the first amphibious assault, and they capture Fort Matangau on the first day of their naval campaign. The following day, they move forward and they capture Fort Nassau. The British militia that was supposed to be guarding the fort basically ran in fear when they saw the Marines coming. So although there was very limited fire, only 3 cannons were fired at the Marines from Fort Matangau. No casualties. The Marines capture 88 cannons and mortars. Unfortunately, Hopkins did not effectively block the port with his ships, so much of the gunpowder was evacuated before the Marines captured Fort Nassau, but they actually captured more cannons than a gentleman named Henry Knox, who went to Fort Ticonderoga to bring cannons back to George Washington to lift the siege of Boston. He only brought like 65 cannons with him. So the Marines captured more cannons. They loaded up the Continental Fleet. They brought those cannons up, but they didn't get into the area until after George Washington had already successfully forced the British to evacuate Boston using the cannons that Henry Knox brought from Fort Ticonderoga. And that name Knox is going to matter here in our coming discussion.
Yeah, 100%. That's such an incredible story. It's crazy that that siege in the Bahamas isn't taught as much. I mean, I'm very familiar with Knox and his little operation at Ticonderoga, but upon coming across your work, I had never heard of this operation down in the Bahamas, which was even more prevalent than Knox's to Ticonderoga. But specifically, John Paul Jones, I feel a special connection to him because I have had the pleasure of going and visiting the Naval Academy where his crypt is under the chapel there, and that was a pretty incredible experience to be able to witness that. John Paul Jones, obviously a legendary figure, um, and his famous words, "I have not yet begun to fight." But this is really the first operation of the Marine Corps and the Navy. Wow, and it was a that's incredible and a resounding success. Really sets the tone for the future of the Marine Corps. But as the war progresses, originally they're attached to the naval vessels, sort of as a supplement to the Navy. Did the Marine Corps' role evolve as the war went on?
Well, generally speaking, they were tied to the fleet throughout the war, with a couple of rare exceptions. And one of those was in December of 1776. After the fleet returned from their raid in New Providence, it went and operated in New England waters predominantly, although they also operated out of Philadelphia as individual ships. But the fleet never really functioned as a cohesive fleet after that for several different reasons. That's another topic for another discussion. But Samuel Nicholas was released from the Alfred to go from Rhode Island, where the fleet was anchored, to Philadelphia to carry the dispatches to report to the Continental Congress on the success of the raid. And when he did that, they promoted him from captain to major, and he wanted to return to his company on board the Alfred, and they denied him in doing that. And the reason for that is because he had another recruiting effort to lead. Because in December of 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the construction of the first 13 frigates for the United States Navy, which would be the first ever warships built from the keel up for that purpose. And construction of those 13 frigates was spread across some of the major ports of the eastern seaboard, and four of them were going to be built in Philadelphia. So the Continental Congress assigned Samuel Nicholas with now leading the recruiting effort in order to man these companies for the four frigates being built in Philadelphia. And one of the people that they commissioned at that time was a gentleman named Robert Mullen. And Robert Mullen was actually the owner of Tun Tavern, where the Marine Committee met on the second story to come up with the plan to create the Marines. So, this is why a lot of people mistakenly call the Marine Corps' birthplace Tun Tavern. But that Robert Mullen did not become a Marine officer until a year later in 1776, not 75 when the Marine Corps was created. The real reason Tun Tavern's the birthplace of the Corps is because the Marine Committee was meeting in that second story room at Tun Tavern a year before Mullen received his commission. But it is true that once Mullen received his commission, he hired two brothers, one as a drummer and one as a fifer, and they toured the streets of Philadelphia with a drum with a coiled rattlesnake on it, said, "Don't trend on me," or "tread on me." And they were playing martial music to attract people into Tun Tavern. And that's where they would set up the recruiting station. And let's say probably got people a little inebriated along the way and help convince them to have the courage to sign on to go fight the British. But Robert Mullen was made one of the four company commanders of those four frigates that were being built in Philadelphia. And as you mentioned earlier, General Washington, once the siege in Boston was complete, he shifted the army to New York, believing that that would be the next target of the British. And in fact, it was. And the British showed up with 32,000 soldiers, to include Hessian mercenaries from the German provinces. And Washington at the time had 19,000 militiamen and the initial soldiers that were recruited to serve in the Continental Army. But they were still neophytes. They didn't really know what they were doing. Washington was defeated in battle after battle. He was pushed out of New York. He lost Manhattan Island. He lost the Battle of Long Island. He moves over the Hudson River into New Jersey. And then Lord Howe basically takes him under pursuit from northern New Jersey all the way until he crosses the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 8th, 1776, using the Delaware River now as a natural obstacle where the British can no longer pursue him, because Washington had the foresight to have all the boats on the river for 70 miles from Philadelphia north collected, so they had no way to cross. So Washington now realizes he needs to seek the initiative and seize the initiative back from the enemy. But his problem is he no longer has the manpower he once had. The 19,000 soldiers he started the New York campaign with had dwindled down to only 2,500 with him in Pennsylvania. And there were some other scatterings of Continental forces still in New York under General Lee and General Gates. But Washington knew that this was a critical point in the revolution, because the British were either going to bring boats down, cross the river, and defeat the army. And if they defeated the army, they defeated the entire revolution. Or they were going to wait for the Delaware River to freeze over and then just cross over the ice. He didn't have a lot of time to operate. He went to the Continental Congress. He said, I need your assistance. They gathered whatever militia forces they could in the area to support Washington. One of those groups were called the Philadelphia Associators, initially created by Benjamin Franklin during the French and Indian War, but they were reinstituted during the start of the American Revolution, and they were under a gentleman named John Cadwalader, whose name will matter here in a moment. Cadwalader goes to Trenton to link up with Washington, but there was already another group waiting there, and that was a battalion of Continental Marines. Because what occurred is, because of Washington's dire straits, the Continental Congress assigned Samuel Nicholas with pulling the Marine companies, the Marine detachments off of those four frigates and creating a battalion of Marines by combining those four companies to go assist Washington and the Continental Army. In essence, what they did was they detached him from the Navy and they attached the Marines to the Continental Army under General Washington. So they load in gondolas, they go up the Delaware River, and they're outside of Trenton to fight for Washington and the Continental Army. But Washington's only recollection of Marines is that they were those dirty buggers who were trying to draw resources off of my army, and I didn't want any part of them. And so he turns to Cadwalader, who he assigns as a brigadier general, and he says, Cadwalader, go talk to Nicholas and the Marines and find out whether they mean to fight on the water or on the land, because there were Continental forces fighting on the Delaware River as well. There was Pennsylvania and New Jersey Navy fighting on the Delaware, as well as a couple of Continental smaller ships. And he said, no, General, they're here to fight for you and the Army. And Washington says, very well, sir, I place them under your command as a separate and distinct battalion. So the battalion of Continental Marines fought as an additional battalion assigned to the Philadelphia Associators for what would become known as the 10 crucial days that included the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Assunpink Creek, and the Battle of Princeton. And I'll pause there.
Wow. What a story. Okay.
And that
So
was the Marines' first protracted land campaign in our history.